Rob had been experiencing a streak of bad luck lately. While in theory a black streak is often followed by a white one, in reality this hasn't been the case for him. Everything started to go downhill for Rob about a year ago, and unfortunately things have only continued to worsen since then. Initially, Rob had been working as a driver for 10 years at a motor transport company and was in good standing. However, a new boss came in and began making changes under the guise of optimization. The boss removed some of the routes, which left several drivers, including Rob, unemployed. Despite opportunities to find a new job, someone else always seemed to get there before Rob. As a result, Rob started working as a taxi driver. Although there were plenty of clients, there were also many cab drivers, so he had to work all day or even at night to earn enough. Amber, Rob's wife, wasn't fond of this arrangement. Her husband was always on the road, and they only had a small amount of money. Although she grumbled and cried at times, she loved Rob nonetheless. Thankfully, everything was going well at the store, where Amber worked as a cashier. Of course, Rob realized that this was not a normal situation and wanted to spoil his wife with gifts, make repairs to their apartment, and have a child. But how could he have a baby when he was always in a state of suspense? Today there was money in his pocket, and tomorrow there was wind in his pocket? One day, Rob was standing at the station. There were few orders because after New Year's Eve, there were always fewer passengers. Suddenly, he saw an old lady walking towards him from the station, tiny as a bird, with an old down shawl on her head, wearing a shabby down jacket. "Dear, take me to the cemetery," she asked when Rob opened the window. Rob was surprised. "To the cemetery?" he asked. "Grandma, it's not the season to go there now, and it's getting dark, and it's not cheap. I won't take less than 100. "It's okay, you just bring me there," the elderly woman replied quietly. "I have money." Rob only shrugged his shoulders. Well, the boss is the boss. The elderly woman didn't seem crazy, so he agreed to take her. On the way, Rob received several calls from Amber. She asked him how much he had earned that day, because he had to make a credit payment for the washing machine the next day, and they had no money at home. Then she called to say that their house was out of groceries and that she would get her paycheck in a week. Sometimes she would call just to argue and break out into a family fight, perhaps out of hopelessness. Rob sluggishly excused himself, promised to bring groceries, find money for the payment, and just listen to his wife. He was so depressed, and it was awful. He was angry even at his passenger, who was sitting quietly in the back seat. The route was not close and it was already getting dark. Why did she have to go to the cemetery? He would obviously have to wait for her there, just burning gasoline. Rob stopped at the central entrance. $50, said Rob, and the elderly woman handed him 2 $100 bills. But it's too much, Rob muttered. Take it all, I see you're a good man, and you need it more than I do, the elderly woman quietly replied. He then added more gently, All right, go and see whoever you want. I'll wait for you and take you back to town. You don't have to wait for me, the elderly woman said, shaking her head. I'll do it myself. Grandma, are you crazy? It's winter outside, and the sun has already set. Are you going to spend the night here? Don't worry, they'll come for me, the passenger replied mumblingly, opening the car door. You go ahead, God bless you. Rob only raised his eyebrows in surprise. Who would come for her? And at this moment, a regular client called him, asking him to come urgently. Rob looked puzzled at the hunched figure moving away from the gate. What did he care about the old woman? Moreover, someone would come for her, as she said. Rob stuffed bills into the inside pocket of his jacket and drove away from the cemetery. For the next hour he drove his regular client around on business, and then there was another good trip. Rob's mood was visibly improving. He was going to make a lot of money today. When he was finally free, he took out the money to count it, and then he was struck by an electric shock. The bills from the old lady seemed strange to him. How did he not notice it at first? Apparently he was on edge. That's why he was distracted. Rob took a closer look and swore in fury. The old woman had deceived him. It was not real banknotes, but souvenir joke ones. The old hag. She played a trick on him, and he was worried about her and how she'd be in the cemetery on a frosty winter evening. What a fool he was. But no, he wouldn't let it go. Rob decided to go to the cemetery. Maybe the old woman was still there, though the chances were slim. But Rob was driven by rage. He wanted to find the old woman and shake her by the scruff of the neck for her bad jokes. He was at the cemetery when it got dark. His emotions had subsided a little, and Rob only shook his head. Why had he come here? The woman had obviously already left, just as she had said. Rob was about to drive back, and then, not far behind the fence, in the light of the moon near the cross, he noticed some movement. Goosebumps involuntarily ran down his back, but most fantastic assumptions suddenly appeared in his head, and he remembered his childhood fears. What if this elderly woman was a ghost, a dead woman? After all, he had heard so many stories in his life when dead people came into contact with living people and then returned to their graveyard. Rob shook his head, as if chasing away all his fears. What did he think up? Was he, a grown man, afraid of some scary stories? Of course not. She probably just didn't know what real money looked like and got confused. Or even worse, she was crazy and had just come to sit on the graves of her relatives, and if she froze, he would unwittingly be responsible for her death because he had brought her. These arguments seemed convincing to Rob. He got out of the car and headed resolutely towards the cemetery. It was night. Silence and murky moonlight glided along the only cleared path. Rob walked, gazing into the darkness, to the place where he had seen some shadow 5 minutes ago. The man stopped in indecision. Footprints were separated from the path, buried in a deep snowdrift. Apparently, the elderly woman had passed through here. But where is she? Damn it! Rob cursed quietly. Where did she go? If I find her, I don't know what I'll do with her because of all my worries. Suddenly, the cloud that covered the edge of the moon sailed farther across the dark sky, and the cemetery was flooded with yellow light. And then Rob saw the elderly woman. She was sitting 50 meters away, covered with snow, pressed against some monument. "Hey, Mum!" Rob shouted at her. "Are you alive there?" Hearing a human voice, the elderly woman shuddered and turned around. Squinting blindly, she tried to see who was calling her, but the frost was already doing its work, and therefore her lips did not obey. Her hands and feet froze. The old woman was freezing. "Have you completely frozen to death out there?" Rob got angry and climbed into the snowdrift. The snow was more than knee-deep. Rob reached the old woman and touched her shoulder. The old woman looked at him and tried to say something, but her lips only moved soundlessly. Rob felt no anger towards the old woman for her deception. He even felt sorry for the poor woman. What could have happened to her that she decided to freeze in the cemetery? Rob examined the inscription on the monument closely. It was the burial site of a woman about 40 years old, perhaps a relative of hers, or even her daughter, Rob thought. "I'm sorry, but you're not going to the grave for nothing. You still owe me," Rob said, before picking her up and dragging her across the snowdrift to the path. The elderly woman didn't speak, but shook, and tears streamed down her face. In the car, Rob poured some hot tea from a thermos and gave her a drink himself. After about 5 minutes, the woman felt a little better. "Why did you come here?" she whispered. "I've told you not to." "Are you kidding?" Rob grinned. "First of all, I couldn't get it out of my head that I left an old woman in the cold at the cemetery. And secondly, you deceived me." "Yes, I'm sorry," she replied quietly. "No one was going to come for me, and I decided to stay here next to my daughter." "You mean to freeze?" Rob clarified sharply. The elderly woman lowered her eyes and nodded. What happened in your life that made you decide to do something like that? Rob whistled in surprise. But no, by deceit, I meant something else. You deceived me in another way. You gave me fake money. What fake money? Gasped the elderly lady. It can't be. The director himself gave it to me. You must have gotten something wrong. I gave you the money out of the goodness of my heart, even more than you asked. Really? Out of the goodness of your heart? Was I wrong? Rob got angry. That's it. Enough. Let's go to the police. Let them deal with you there. No, not the police, sobbed the old woman. They'll take me back to the nursing home again, and I can't stay there. It's better to leave me here. I want to die next to my daughter. I'm ready for that, and I want that. As for the money, I'm sorry if I cheated. It's not out of malice. Here, take this. It's not expensive, but it's still worth something. She pulled out of her pocket a silver chain with an angel-shaped pendant. This belonged to my daughter Judith, the woman said, wiping away her tears. I gave it to her when she was in school. I found it after her death, and it's been with me ever since, but now I don't need it. She held out the chain, her hand trembling, tears streaming down her face. Rob felt a pang in his chest. The elderly woman didn't seem like a liar. Put the chain back in your pocket, he said. Let it be with you, and forget about the money. I believe you didn't mean to deceive me. Probably you yourself have been a victim of deceit. Tell me about yourself. What's your name? My name is Margaret Collins, the woman answered calmly, sighed, clasped the chain in her dry palm, pressing it to her chest. After my daughter and son-in-law died, I've been living in a nursing home, but it was unbearable there, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. Why is it unbearable in the nursing home? Rob asked, looking thoughtfully at Mrs. Collins. Sadly shaking her head, she began to recount her story. Mrs. Collins had lived in the village her entire life. Her husband died when she was young, and she raised her daughter Judith alone. Judith was intelligent and beautiful, and graduated from the college in the city, where she met her future husband. They eventually got married, and Mrs. Collins prayed every day that happiness would not leave her daughter's house. Judith and Mark enjoyed a good life together, but one disappointment was that they were unable to have children. However, they eventually grew accustomed to the idea that they lived only for each other and continued to love each other no matter what. As Mrs. Collins' health began to deteriorate, her daughter brought her to live with her in the city. Mrs. Collins lived with her daughter and son-in-law for 2 years, and everything was normal. However, a terrible accident occurred. Judith and Mark went on vacation, and on a serpentine road, the bus they were travelling in went down into a ravine. Many people died, including Judith and Mark. Mrs. Collins buried them herself, which was a difficult and painful experience, but she managed to hold herself together and take care of everything that needed to be done. After the funeral, Mrs. Collins was left with no strength. When a young girl appeared in the apartment, claiming to be Mark's daughter and having all the rights to the apartment, Mrs. Collins didn't argue. There was no point in arguing, as the girl really resembled her late son-in-law. It turned out that Mark had a will signed by him, and it indicated that things were not smooth between him and Mrs. Collins's daughter, and it was unclear whether Judith knew about his illegitimate daughter. Now, no one can say. Mrs. Collins decided to go to the nursing home herself, and everything worked out well for her. She called the social office, inquired about a place, and was told that there was just one vacancy. The nursing home was ordinary, but Mrs. Collins did not need luxurious apartments. She was a country woman, accustomed to living simple. Mrs. Collins would have gone to the village, but she had sold her house, and her daughter and son-in-law did not have enough money for a new car. That was why her only option was to go to the nursing house. However, soon Mrs. Collins realised that the nursing home was called a house of mercy only on paper. In reality, it was like a very ordinary prison. The residents were let out for walks strictly on schedule, fed poorly, and given only the cheapest medicines. Additionally, 75% of their pensions were taken to cover living costs. The elderly people did not ask where the money went, as they were afraid of the director, who acted like a dictator. Rumours circulated that the director used to be a chief in the prison system and ran the nursing home like a prison. Mrs. Collins found it hard to adapt to life in the nursing home, and she regretted agreeing to go there. She wanted to transfer to another place, but it was not possible. When the director, Mr. Benneth, found out about her desire to transfer, he looked at her in a way that made the elderly woman sit down in fear. And then the director suddenly began to wonder how much money the tenants had saved from the 25% of their pension they had given him. The director expressed that it would be better to exchange everything for large bills, since the elderly residents had nowhere to spend smaller denominations, and larger bills were safer. Consequently, they gave Mrs. Collins those fake bills, and she herself was unaware that something was amiss with the paper and blindly accepted it. And then one day Mrs. Collins felt incredibly sad and questioned why she even continued to live. She had no relatives in the world and nowhere to spend her money. The final straw was the death of her friend, with whom they shared the room. The neighbour had a hypertensive crisis, yet instead of calling an ambulance or administering medicine, the nurse simply brought her a wet towel to put on her forehead. The neighbour died the next morning. This experience led Mrs. Collins to contemplate her own life and to question why she was waiting for death in a cage. On the morning of the nursing home inspection, the elderly residents were intimidated and warned not to complain. They were all washed and redressed and allowed to watch TV in the hall. The inspectors saw clean and content elderly residents watching movies. The elderly people saw how warmly Mr. Benneth greeted the inspectors, and so they all stayed quiet and with feeling helpless. Mrs. Collins sat in the hall, staring at the front door, wishing she could escape. Where to? She didn't know. However, it was winter outside, and she didn't have any warm clothes. At that moment, a worker came into the nursing home. She took off her jacket and shawl at the entrance and went to the kitchen with the orderlies. The elderly people were left unattended for a while. Mrs. Collins seized the opportunity, grabbed the woman's clothes and ran outside. After putting on the down jacket and shawl, she ran to the nearby bus stop. The other old men watched through the window as if blessing her. At least one of them would escape. By chance, a shuttle bus pulled up right away. Mrs. Collins didn't think about where to go as long as it was far away. She had money in the secret pocket of her sweater. She paid the fare and left for the train station. Mrs. Collins didn't know whether they were looking for her or not. They probably hushed it up at once so that there would be no embarrassment in front of the inspectors. Mrs. Collins wandered around the station thinking, yes, her daughter was calling her. She got into a cab. At the cemetery, she quickly found her daughter's grave, hugged the gravestone, and sat waiting for her end. "I'm sorry, dear," Mrs. Collins said to Rob at the end of her story. "I gave you the money out of the goodness of my heart, and I didn't know that they were fake." "I've already understood," Rob replied sullenly, thinking about what he had heard. What should he do now? Of course he should go to the police, but until they sort it out, they'll send the elderly woman back to the nursing home. What if they punish her for running away? "All right, darling, forgive me if you can," Mrs. Collins said quietly. "I'll go now." "Where to?" Rob was surprised. back to my daughter." "Oh, don't be silly," Rob exclaimed and locked the doors. "Do you want to freeze?" "Okay, but then I'll blame myself for the death of a woman for the rest of my life. That's not fair to me. Okay, it's decided. You're coming with me." "Where to?" Mrs. Collins mumbled in fear. "To my house. You'll rest and come to your senses, and in the morning we'll decide where to complain." This decision came spontaneously, and it was the right one. Let Mrs. Collins spend the night at his place, and in the morning we'd have to call the police. But he won't let her go anywhere until she's placed in a proper nursing home. "Son, how will your wife react to this?" The elderly woman was confused when she heard Rob's suggestion. "I don't think she needs a stranger's grandmother in the house." "She'll react normally." "She'll react normally." Rob waved her away. "She sometimes likes to quarrel, of course, but she gets over it quickly. Amber will understand." It should be said that Amber saw her husband with Mrs. Collins. She was speechless, but Rob took her to the kitchen and explained the situation. "So you want her to live with us?" Amber was indignant. "Just for a little while, until the police sort it out." Well, I felt sorry for the old woman. Amber grinned and thought, "Well, let her spend the night and then we'll see." Mrs. Collins was standing in the hallway, realizing that she was not welcome here either. Meanwhile, Amber looked out of the kitchen. "Take off your outer clothes. Let's drink tea," she called to the elderly woman. Mrs. Collins hesitantly took off her jacket and shawl, and then Amber gasped. "Mrs. Collins, is that you? Don't you recognize me? It's Amber, Amber Gibson." "Are you Helen and Ben's daughter from our village?" "Well, yes," Amber nodded, and then it was Rob's turn to be speechless and not understand anything, while the women embraced. It turned out that Mrs. Collins was from the same village as his wife. The elderly woman lived next door to Amber's parents. So now the ice has finally melted in communication. Amber warmly accepted Mrs. Collins, fed her, gave her a drink, helped her bathe, and then put the elderly woman to bed in the living room. And then she called her parents in the village. When they found out what their poor neighbour had been through, they immediately asked Rob to take her to them. Even though Mrs. Collins's house had long had other owners, there were several strong empty houses in the village. The whole village would help her settle down by summer. Meanwhile, she would stay with them. No nursing homes. In the morning, Amber told the elderly woman about her parents' offer. Mrs. Collins thought about it and agreed. Rob took her to the village, but before they went to the police, where Mrs. Collins told them in detail about what was going on in the nursing home. Sometime later, a large-scale prosecutor's audit of the nursing home began. Many violations and crimes were revealed. The investigation also managed to prove that the director was involved in cheating old people. He was jailed for a decent term, and in general, the staff of the nursing home was changed. Now the elderly people lived decently there. There is no trace of their past fears. But Mrs. Collins won't go back there anyway. She's fine in her native village. And Rob's black streak was finally over. One day he gave a ride to a man who turned out to be a big shot. Mr. Garrison liked Rob's driving and behaviour on the road, and he offered him a job as a personal driver, and the salary was 3 times more than he earned at taxi. Of course, Rob accepted that offer. Everything in his life has improved, and he and Amber are living peacefully. They are waiting for a baby. Yes, indeed, the black streak in life passes. The main thing is not to be angry at this time, at the whole world, not to harden your heart, and then fate will definitely smile on you.